Hello and welcome to the Charles River Conservancy Parkland Show. My name is Renata von Turner. I'm the founder and president of the Charles River Conservancy, and today we have a very special guest, Charles Sullivan. Welcome.
Thank you.
Charles Sullivan is the executive director of the Cambridge Historical Commission, and he knows so much about the Charles. It just fills me with envy to have him here, his book here. This is his book. It's a really wonderful book, and I will ask him a bit about the book, and then we will talk about the pictures and the text in this book. The book is called Building Old Cambridge, about the Charles River. But let's get back to you, and how did you end up at the Cambridge Historical Commission, and how did you end up writing this book?
Well, I started at the Historical Commission in 1974. I trained as a city planner, not as an historian. I was interested more in conserving neighborhoods and buildings rather than redeveloping them. So I developed an interest in Cambridge history. The Historical Commission had been founded in 1963 and had already published 4 or 5 books on Cambridge neighborhoods.
Books, yeah, but nothing like that.
Nothing like that.
Nothing like that.
We published a new volume on East Cambridge in 1988 with the MIT Press, and then we started thinking about Old Cambridge, which is the traditional name of the neighborhood around Harvard Square. Mm-hmm. Until about 1800, there was only one village in present-day Cambridge, and that was the village around the college at Harvard Square. The first bridge was built directly to Boston in 1793, and before you knew it, Cambridgeport and East Cambridge developed as new villages on virgin land on the east side of Cambridge. So the original village became known as Old Cambridge, and gradually the town center shifted to the new areas. Old Cambridge focused more and more on the university and on becoming a suburb of Boston. Mm-hmm. So there's enormous history there, layers and layers of history, not only residential and the university, but also transportation and industry.
And these are the various chapters in your book are about that, which is a book both about architecture and the development and the urban planning.
Right. Yeah. We've covered a lot of social history and economic history. We focus on individual neighborhoods within Old Cambridge, how those streets developed, who was responsible, what kind of buildings there are there, and who settled in them. It's a very thickly layered history of the development.
Yeah, well, if you have lived in Cambridge, I came here in '79, or if you've just moved here, this is definitely something you want to have on your coffee table, your bedside, because it's so rich. So it is. Thank you. What a wonderful gift to Cambridge and to everybody who lives here. This is extraordinary.
Thank you.
So let's go right into in medias res. I mean, in a way, the river is tangential to Old Cambridge and Cambridge. It separates us from Boston, but in another way, it's also very central.
Yes, well, the town was sited on the banks of the Charles River in 1630. It was intended to be the capital of Massachusetts, not Boston, but Cambridge was intended to be the capital of Massachusetts. So,
and was it for a while?
And it was for 4 years.
For 4 years.
And then the legislature decided Boston was a better choice after all. They moved in 1634, and in 1636 they looked back and saw that nothing was happening in Cambridge, so they gave us Harvard College as sort of a consolation prize.
All right.
In their absence. But the river was the major traffic artery for decades. It was much easier to transport goods, especially heavy goods, lumber, building materials. But even agricultural products were more easily transported by the river than they were over the roads at the time.
Even with the river being tidal, that was still easier.
Even with the river being tidal, the river was tidal until about 1910, but it sustained a substantial commercial traffic right up to the falls in Watertown. which the river was deep enough so that the Watertown Arsenal maintained a wharf until 1890, when the War Department finally gave it up.
Yeah.
But for commercial traffic, sailing vessels, as you'll see, and barges carried cargoes of coal and lumber and building materials, paving stones and the like, up to wharves along Cambridgeport and in Old Cambridge until 1892.
Yeah, so let's go to which looks like one of the earliest images. And if you love maps and you love to figure out where you are, and you feel that we're moving way too fast because we have to kind of want to cover quite a bit, these shows are normally put on YouTube, so you can then find them on YouTube and take your time of studying. And of course you want to get that book and go to the local bookstore or to the Cambridge Historical Commission on Mass Avenue and get your copy. That's just down the street from here at 831 Mass Avenue, and get your copy. And it's a book that has been subsidized by the city of Cambridge, which is wonderful, because otherwise this would be a very expensive book.
Only $49.95.
Now it's only $49, which is a steal for all what it is. So this is a fascinating map. Tell us what puzzled you when you discovered that map.
Well, this is a map drawn by a British military engineer before the Revolution in the early 1770s, and it shows the Charles River coming down from the left past the great curve where the Harvard Stadium is now, across from the village that's now Harvard Square, down to, down to the Back Bay, which in the 18th century and until the 19th century was actually a bay. Boston is shown in red at the end of its peninsula. Historically, that narrow peninsula between South Cove and Back Bay would overwash at some times during storms, making Boston essentially an island. Directly north of Boston is Charlestown, and to the upper left of Boston is a drumlin that is the site of East Cambridge with the Millers River. Just above that, and then the Mystic River going off to the northwest. So this shows pretty graphically the nature of the river at low tide. You can see there is a channel through the mudflats in the Back Bay. There are extensive salt marshes on both sides of the river in the vicinity of Kenmore Square, all along where MIT is now, along the Esplanade, and on both sides of the Charles, all the way up almost to Watertown.
Mm-hmm. So when we look at the area here that was not salt marshes, what would that be about here, this beginning in Cambridge? What street would be running where the salt marshes ended? Where would that be?
Well, that would be roughly Albany Street, Sydney Street. The area east of Harvard Yard had only 3 farms, one of which was in East Cambridge on Leechmer's Point. Only had 3 farms before the first bridge was built from today's Kenmore Square to the foot of Beacon Hill in 1793. So all of that blank area east of the village was pasture, woodland. It was very rarely frequented. The most valuable crop down there was the salt marsh hay. The salt marshes were harvested very intensively, but the upland behind them was not very fertile. People pastured, picked wild fruit and berries, hunted, but it wasn't intensively farmed.
Yeah, yeah. And you have a picture here of the salt marshes.
Yes, this is looking downstream from Gary's Landing near the BB&N school. The river is flowing away from you. The structure on the far left is the Granite Wharf at the foot of Spark Street, and then the river sweeps around. Soldiers Field is now on the right, where the men are harvesting salt marsh hay. And in fact, you can see on the far right a hay rick, a haystack
Yeah.
with teams bringing hay to it. That's just how hay was harvested and stored on salt marshes throughout New England.
Would that be sold to feed to animals?
Well, it was fed to animals. It was also used for bedding plants. Salt marsh hay seeds don't germinate because they only germinate in salt water. So you can lay down hay in your garden and it will protect the soil and the plants without actually spreading grass seed in your garden. Whereas normal hay spreads its seeds and then you end up growing grass in your strawberries instead of strawberries.
Now there are some structures, churches and towers. Are these structures that still exist today?
Well, yes. The boat in the foreground has a mast, and to the right of that mast is the tower of Memorial Hall. And then to the right of that is the first church, or the first parish in Harvard Square. Mm-hmm. Then another building to the right, the conical shaped structure, is a gas holder at the foot of Ash Street.
So it was on the river also.
That we'll see later on in the slideshow.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is a later map from actually surveyed in 1847 that shows the navigation channel. 50 years after that first Revolutionary era map, you can see how Cambridge has begun to fill in with East Cambridge in the upper corner, Cambridgeport right in the center of the map. All of those streets, all of those houses are new, have appeared since 1793. This was truly a Western boomtown situation of people moving in at this time from northern New England into Cambridgeport, but into East Cambridge, many laborers, skilled workers from Germany and Scotland working in the glass industry.
Yeah. And was the river deep enough for navigation, or did they have to constantly dig a canal to make that happen?
Well, there were canals dug in Kendall Square, the Broad Canal, the Leishmere Canal, served navigation, but they emptied out at low tide, and so vessels that wanted to serve the Charles River had to be
look at the chart, the tidal chart.
Well, they had to have hulls that would withstand grounding on the mud flats at low tide.
Yeah.
And not break apart or tip over.
Yeah.
So the channel soundings are, I think they're feet at mean low water. So there is a kind of a channel up past Boston, partway up to around where the BU Bridge is. And above that, you had to mind the tides, sail in on a rising tide, be prepared to ground, to dock and ground your ship, and then come out on a falling tide.
Yeah, and of course, all the bridges had to open.
And all the bridges had draws in them.
Yeah, yeah. And here that gives some depth chart, but also some wharfs. Give us an idea of what the bridge is, the one in the center of the picture.
Bridge directly in the center is the site of today's Anderson Bridge. So Harvard Square would be at the top of the map of the center, at the head of John F. Kennedy Street, and the stadium would be just to the lower right off the map, to the left lower left off the bridge. The business school would be to the lower right at the bridgehead on the south side.
Everything we see here pretty much along the Charles was just salt marshes.
Yes, the salt marshes are pretty clearly shown here. The wharves are, there are three wharves close to Harvard Square: the Winthrop's Wharf, Sergeant's Wharf, and the College Wharf, and then upstream is the Brick Wharf. We'll see some details of these a little bit later. The College Wharf is next to a dock that was excavated from the town creek. The town creek ran through Harvard Yard, through Harvard Square, around through Brattle Square, and followed what's today Elliott Street, across Kennedy Street, and into the Charles River, where the College Wharf is shown on this map. The early colonists dug it out and made a canal there so that they could bring their ships in and dock them against a hard surface.
So I assume the Brick Wharf, that's where brick was loaded, and what would be loaded at the other wharfs? What would be typical?
Well, Sergeant's Wharf was primarily a lumber wharf. William Winthrop was a merchant in the late 18th and early 19th century. He partnered with Harvard College to bring firewood from Maine in his own sloop, and then Harvard built a two-masted schooner of its own, and carried its own wood down from lands in Maine to heat the college buildings. And that was unloaded at Winthrop's Wharf and at the College Wharf. The College Wharf was the original town wharf. The college bought it in the early 19th century, so they would have a place to unload fuel for the dormitories.
For the dormitories, yeah.
So this is a view from about 1855, before the Civil War. This shows how navigation was handled as soon as steam propulsion became available in the 18 teens and 20s in Boston Harbor. That's a steam-powered tug that's towing a schooner downstream past Magazine Beach. Past Cottage Farm is the farm on the other side of the river in Brookline.
So the building we see on there would be in Brookline.
Would be in Brookline, about where the Fuller Cadillac building was.
All right.
On Commonwealth Avenue.
Yeah.
And then the little rectangles are freight cars on the Boston and Albany line that still runs parallel to the river.
Yeah. So these are, many of these images I had never seen before. They're fascinating, although, as you know, Carl Hagelin did a book, Inventing the Charles River, but you obviously had very deep sources. So tell me where many of your images came from that you used.
Well, we've been looking for images for years, and the commercial use of the river is a particular interest of mine. Mm-hmm. So many of the images that you'll see later came from the Harvard archives because they documented the rowing cruise. Harvard was using the river recreationally starting in the 1860s.
Yeah.
So some of the commercial uses, the wharves, show up in the background of those pictures.
And we have a wonderful picture here.
Yes, this is one of the Harvard pictures from the Harvard yearbook in 1862. It's a detail of this scene. So the subject of the scene was I think the sophomore boat, which is cropped out to show the lumber wharves, piles of lumber stacked on Sergeant's Wharf.
Lots of lumber, that is very...
Enormous piles of lumber, because probably every house in Cambridge, it was built before railroads began tapping the New England forests in the 1870s, came by water to wharves like this in Cambridge Port and East Cambridge. And then behind, you can see the masts of four two-masted schooners that are unloading on the College Wharf.
Yeah, so they would sail on the Atlantic, and then they would take off their sails and go upriver?
Yes, I mean, these were coastal schooners. They, in this case, they're bringing lumber from ports in Maine, mainly from Bangor, but many other ports, Wiscasset, among others. They were also bringing granite from Rockport and Gloucester, from the Maine Islands, and later on bringing coal from Nova Scotia and from Norfolk and Hampton Roads.
So this was really the commercial hub of Old Cambridge.
This is the commercial hub. This is an area that's now entirely parkland.
So tell us what we would find in this particular spot today.
Well, at the very far left is the what would become the Anderson Bridge. That's the Great Bridge. So you would be seeing Eliot House here and Winthrop House, but none of these buildings survive. All of this was taken away by the city of Cambridge when it developed the park system beginning in 1892.
So would we be standing about where the Weeks Bridge is?
Just about, yes.
Looking upriver?
Yeah.
So in a way, where these buildings are, that's where the Revels have river sing every year.
Yes.
So that's the way it looked like. It's just amazing, and it's 1862. That's not a long time ago. It's amazing changes. Yeah.
So this is standing on the Great Bridge, which was replaced by the Anderson Bridge, looking upstream. And actually the 2, 4, 6 buildings in the distance are still standing
still there,
on
yeah.
Mount Auburn Street at the corner of Willard Street.
And so they're right next to the tennis club there.
Right next to the tennis club.
Yeah.
The brick wharf is in the center. The Conical Building is the gas holder of the Cambridge Gas Company. We'll get a detailed view of that in a moment.
All right.
There it is. This was a structure that was built in 1852. Gas was introduced to American cities in the 1840s. It had to be manufactured by heating coal. So coal was brought by schooner to the brick wharf, which is on the right here, unloaded and heated in a furnace. When you heat coal, it drove off gas, which was captured in an iron tank, which is inside that conical structure. And the iron tank is inverted, and it's riding in a water seal so that the tank rises and falls depending on how much gas is pumped into it. And then the weight of the tank is pushing gas through the gas mains to the houses in Old Cambridge. The brick structure is serving to keep the water seal from freezing in the winter. So you had to keep that heated to some degree. That was taken down in 1900 and replaced about 1914 by the Memorial Drive apartments. The other, this is at the foot of Ash Street. The other interesting building here in the left foreground is the casino. The Cambridge Casino was a private club founded by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's children and some of their friends. To provide a boat landing. They also had tennis courts and a bowling alley here. They're the predecessor of the Cambridge Boat Club and the Cambridge Skating Club.
Yeah, right on the river. But when they had that casino here, the river was probably a very smelly affair.
It was a very smelly affair. There were sewer outfalls at Spark Street and at the foot of Holyoke Street, and so there was a great deal of complaint about those, and actually Harvard moved some of its boathouses away from the foot of Holyoke Street to get away from the sewer outfalls. But the tidal range in the Charles was 9 feet, and so you can get a sense of that here. This is probably about a half tide. Halfway to low tide. You can get a sense of that from the steepness of the ramp leading down to the casino's float.
So that means the river also was flushed on a regular basis, which definitely helped. Yeah.
And so this is just upstream at the foot of Spark Street. This is the Granite Wharf. It's so called because Alexander McDonald had a granite business. He brought in granite by water to this wharf, which is just about where 1010 Memorial Drive is today. And he also had another yard opposite Mount Auburn Cemetery with a railroad siding that served his quarries in New Hampshire. And then looking downstream from the Great Bridge in about 1900, that hugely 300-foot-long structure with Richardson and Bacon on the roof was on the College Wharf. So that was a building that was built to house fuel, mostly coal, under cover, that was unloaded by schooners there. As you saw in one of the earlier photographs of the masts in the distance, they were unloading fuel at Richardson and Bacon's Wharf, and then Sergeant's Wharf with its lumber, and then way down is Winthrop's Wharf.
Now, the river looks much wider than when you stand on the Anderson Bridge today. Is that just an illusion, or was the river wider?
It's partly an illusion. The banks were totally landscaped. When you stand on the Great Bridge or anywhere else on the Charles River today, you're looking at a totally man-made landscape.
Yeah.
Every single feature that you see on the banks has been reshaped by man.
Yeah.
So yes, so the riverbanks have been straightened and reinforced, and I think made narrower at this point as well.
Yeah.
So this is at the Riverside Press Wharf. The Riverside Press was a printing plant at today's Riverside Press Park between River Street and Western Avenue on the Charles River.
Are any of these buildings still standing?
None of these buildings are still standing, but the stone seawall is still standing.
All right.
Between, let's see, River Street is on the right. The wooden structure is part of the drawbridge at the River Street. And all of those buildings were cleared in the 1970s after Houghton Mifflin closed the printing plant and gave most of the site to the city of Cambridge. But this is a schooner probably unloading fuel. I don't think they shipped books by sea.
Fuel, they would
and
coal.
probably didn't bring in paper, but they could have. But
Yeah,
they
yeah.
certainly would have brought in coal.
Coal, yeah.
This was a this was a major user of the river, and then to the immediate left was the Cambridge Electric Company, built their power plant, which is still there, and they also brought in fuel by river
Yeah.
at first.
Yeah, there are still some buildings next to the Riverside Park, so these would have been to the left of that and would have been part of that industrial
Yes,
area.
yes.
Yeah.
And then this is one of the final views in this section, but the old Cambridge Waterfront in 1897. This is looking from the top of a chimney that belonged to a power plant that the Boston Elevated Railway built on John F. Kennedy Street on the Charles River. So the Great Bridge, the Anderson Bridge, would be off behind you to your right. Mm-hmm. You can see Richardson and Bacon's coal wharf in the foreground. And we're looking down at the Sergeant Wharf with a schooner, which I think is unloading paving blocks. One of the last commercial shipments to arrive on the river in Old Cambridge was a shipment of paving blocks from the Hudson Valley, actually paving bricks that were a very special product, very heavy, very dense. They were shipped from the Hudson Valley by water around Cape Cod to Old Cambridge.